We might get started. I just wanted to begin today by acknowledging that we meet on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to elders past and present and emerging leaders. I think Aboriginal custodianship of this land is a significant feature for all of us working on the decarbonisation landscape. The uneven and sometimes faltering process of reconciliation really is more than a simple backdrop to the sustainability challenges that we face. Questions of land ownership and sovereignty are really at the heart of these challenges. So I think it's very important that as we reflect on questions of transformation in the land sector, that we think about how the process of reconciliation co-evolves with the restructuring of our fossil fuel intensive society. And I'd just like to acknowledge a lot of the excellent research that goes on at the University of Melbourne, where we co-produce knowledge with Indigenous people whilst also respecting Indigenous ecological knowledge and their ongoing stewardship of this land. So my name is Sangeetha Chandrasekharan. I'm the Deputy Director of the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute. I'm one of the, my institute is one of the many co-hosts of this seminar series. And you can see them all along here. Today we're really looking forward to hearing from Professor Ross Garnaut, who will speak on transforming land use and production, transforming land use and food production and consumption. Many of you have attended the other lectures in this series. This is the 5th of 6. So we have the final lecture next week at the same time, but in a different venue at the, I think you have the details on a slide.
The
Garnaut, which is just over in the Sydney, in the Sydney Myer building. Yeah. Great. Professor Garnaut probably needs no introduction, so I won't spend too much time on it. He is a professorial research fellow here at the University of Melbourne and has had long-standing and successful roles as a policy advisor, as a diplomat, and as a businessman. He's authored influential reports such as the Garnaut Review in 2008 and again in 2011, and has played an active role in industry. So without further ado, I might hand it over to Ross. Thank you.
Thank you, Sangeetha, and thank you those of you who've stayed the course with me. The 2008 review, chapter 22, and the 2011 review, chapter 10, drew attention to the exceptional contribution to global as well as Australian mitigation that could be made by changing Australian land use. Australia's comparative strengths had two sources. The first was exceptionally large endowment of woodlands, forests and other land relative to population. This gave Australia, first of all, its historical comparative advantage in land-based products and exporter of land-based products. The second was our exceptional expertise in the land-based industries, from agricultural and forestry science through agricultural and resource economics to public and private knowledge and institutional arrangement supporting commercial success in those industries. Advanced knowledge and innovation had been necessary for the transplanting of European-style agriculture in an unpropitious physical environment. Some of you might know Jeff Raby's book based on his PhD thesis at La Trobe that is about the very early research and innovation that was necessary to transplant European agriculture here. Research, innovation and education supported by public institutions had been important from the earliest times. Mark Twain found the agricultural research in Horsham in Western Victoria worth an honourable mention on his 19th century visit. The CSIRO had its origins in applied research for the agricultural and pastoral industries. The distinctively Japanese system for trading rural and later all commodities through multi-product integrated trading companies had its origin in the Japan-Australia wool trade. Wool futures were traded in Sydney before there was a Chicago Futures Exchange. The Australian influence was centrally important to the development of the international agricultural research system and remains so. Innovation in rural production and regulatory arrangements were going to be necessary for Australia and the world to take full advantage of opportunities for land-based innovation in mitigation. Rules for measuring and accounting for land use emissions were immature at the time of my earlier reports and had to be developed on sound principles. Other developed countries which had shaped the rules did not share Australia's opportunity or interest. Australian expertise, I said back in 2008 and 2011, could help to develop environmentally and economically efficient international rules. Our knowledge on the land use transformation could be of particular assistance to Australia's neighbours in Southeast Asia and the South Pacific. The special Australian place in this space was the subject of remarkable commentary by the first distinguished fellow of the Australian Economic Society in the first book about development economics, Colin Clark's 1940 book, Conditions of Economic Progress. Clark sought to allay concerns that the dependence of modern economic development on fossil energy and the finite nature of coal and oil resources would bring economic growth to an end. Back in 1940, he noted that we can calculate the likely amount of undiscovered fossil fuels from the carbon that was once in the atmosphere. Quote, however, we must not set out to burn them up too fast, even if we do find them, he said. At any rate, not faster than the rate at which the carbon dioxide can be converted by photosynthesis. But Clark reassured us that keeping the use of fossil fuels within the limits of what can be absorbed by photosynthesis need not be the end of economic growth. There is an abundance of solar energy falling on the earth, he said, if we know how to tap it. The best method at present, he said, is the proven process of photosynthesis in trees. The eucalypt is the most productive agent for conversion of solar energy into biomass at present, he calculated. Algae has the potential to do better. The silicon battery that's just been discovered at Cambridge University and other recent discoveries, he said, may do better still someday. So the importance of the Australian eucalypt sustaining economic growth without excessive carbonisation of the atmosphere was recognised 80 years ago at the beginning of development economics. And my own first professional contact with climate change came through rural development. I was chair of the International Food Policy Research Institute in Washington in the 2000s when analysis of food security issues identified climate change as a long-term threat in South Asia and Africa. The 2008 review noted the historic lift in world food prices in the first decade of this century. Rising living standards and increasing demand for high-quality food in developing countries would make this an expanding opportunity over a long period for Australian farmers, unless climate change at home damaged Australian supply capacity. And Australian farm capacity would be reduced by a failure of global mitigation. For example, this is the 2008 review, where irrigation output in the Murray-Darling was likely to decline by 90% in the absence of mitigation. In 2008, I brought into the mainstream discussion some early work by the CSIRO and State Departments of Agriculture on the immense mitigation potential of changes in land use. The nurturing of vegetation on the dry, degraded mulga country, where rainfall was spasmodic in Queensland and New South Wales, could be transformative. Innovative uses of the properties of Australian eucalypts, including farming of the mallee on the arid boundaries of crop cultivation, for subterranean sequestration and for harvesting biomass, was another matter that I highlighted. I referred to the adaptability of Australian meat consumption choices, the way in my lifetime we'd gone from huge consumption of mainly sheep meat and beef to a much more diverse pattern of meat use. I made a passing reference to reducing emissions by going back to traditional Australian patterns of meat consumption, substituting some zero emissions kangaroo for high emissions beef and lamb in production and consumption, and which received exaggerated attention and some derision. I received, when my report came out, I received a call from the ABC asking if I'd go on their main Sunday current affairs program the next Sunday. And that was a welcome query, but I was cautious enough to say, well, who else will be on the program? And they lined up London's 3 best chefs, and they wanted to talk about whether the British public would shift from the traditional British roast beef to kangaroo. I declined to go on the program. I said they weren't being serious. Research and regulatory development was necessary. I emphasize this in the report, for us to make the most of opportunity for mitigation in farming and land use. That was the 2008 review. In 2011, I took the land use mitigation story further and advocated the inclusion of offset from agriculture into the emissions trading scheme through what became the Carbon Farming Initiative. I suggested then that sequestration under the Carbon Farming Initiative could be a major new farm business, contributing as much as the wool industry to farm income by 2030. Carbon Farming Initiative was legislated in 2011 alongside the Clean Energy Future Package. Regulatory arrangements were developed by the Clean Energy Regulator. Chloe Munro was here last week, and she has a very close link with the Australian-German College here and Transition Hub. She had the job as Chief Executive of making that all work. These arrangements were carried into the Abbott, Turnbull and Morrison government's Emissions Reduction Fund. Insofar as it related to farming and land use, the Emissions Reduction Fund was a clunky, truncated and less adequately funded version of the emissions trading scheme linked Carbon Farming Initiative. It required resources from general revenue rather than from sales of emissions permits. But clunky or not, Abbott's ERF kept alive the sale of offsets as a way of providing incentives for farm sector sequestration. The arrangements developed by the Clean Energy Regulator showed how an offset scheme could work. 2011 review also put climate change into a broader global development story. It noted that the rise in living standards and fall in fertility in the early homes of economic development in Western Europe had allowed part and over time an increasing proportion of humanity to free itself from the Malthusian trap that had held back living standards of ordinary people since the Neolithic revolution early in the Holocene. Failure to mitigate climate change would lock many people into the Malthusian trap, as declining food production capacity fed back into living standards and fertility in important parts of the developing world. So in this lecture, I want to discuss Australia's progress since 2011 on understanding and using its unusual endowment of land suitable for sequestering carbon, on the complementary story of reducing emissions in agriculture, and on using our knowledge to improve the global rules on agriculture and land use, and to reconcile rising global standards with reducing emissions. I raised all of these issues in 2008 and 2011. How far have we got? Well, overall, I can say that Australia's had mixed success in reducing emissions from agriculture and land use. The positive outcomes are clear and big enough to encourage us to complete the job. It's only become clear since 2011, at least to me, that Australia's potential strength in low-cost production and use of biomass can provide the most cost-effective path to zero emissions production of many manufactures from chemicals processes. Those who were here in Lecture 4 will recall that quite a lot of industry can be made zero emissions through electrification, and either directly or through the use of hydrogen. Those that can't can mainly the chemical industries based on the chemical properties of oil, gas, and coal. And these can be taken to a zero emissions future through the use of carbon in biomass. So that capacity to produce low-cost biomass can be a source of Australian comparative advantage in another set of zero emissions industries. Over the past 8 years, there has been increasing awareness that a transformation of land use alongside food and raw material consumption and production is necessary for continued global development. Sorry about the cough. The spreading of the high standards of material living enjoyed in the developed countries to the whole of humanity. It turns out that a similar agricultural land use transformation is necessary to reach our global goals for containing the cost of climate change. Similar transformation is necessary for improved human nutrition and health, and similar transformation is necessary for wider ecological stability, including maintenance of the diversity of life on Earth that is necessary for the sustainability of many dimensions of modern life and society. So these four transformations, each of them very important in itself, but they're all demanding the same sort of change in food consumption and land use. It's worth drawing attention to recent landmarks in the growth of these four dimensions of the imperative for transformation of land use. Recent IPCC reports have elevated the importance of natural climate solutions to achieving global mitigation ambitions. Recent studies report that natural climate solutions can provide 35% of cost-effective reduction in carbon emissions through to 2030 for a 2/3 chance of holding warming below 2 degrees. And for this and much else, I'm grateful for a lot of help from Kate Durley from the Energy Transition Hub. And Kate, I think, is listening in on the web from the Grampians. Native forest restoration and reforestation could sequester up to 480 gigatons of carbon dioxide in terrestrial ecosystems. It's in the world as a whole, sufficient to meet the negative emissions of many modeled 1.5 degree scenarios. And then there's another set of research at the International Food Policy Research Institute and the World Bank, which has drawn attention to the upward pressure on world grain prices that would accompany continuation of tendencies for people in developing countries to consume more and more meat products as incomes grow. On this question, just a few weeks ago, we had earlier this year, we had the EAT Lancet report showing that a large fall in global average consumption of red meats and increase in direct consumption of legumes, pulses, and other plant-based foods was necessary for improvement of human health on a global scale. Just this week, we've had the report from the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, drawing attention to a biodiversity crisis that threatens ecological systems of fundamental importance to human welfare. So from the perspective of the sustainability of modern economic development and the transfer of high living conditions to all the people on Earth, and from the point of view of climate change mitigation and the point of view of ecological stability and biodiversity, and from the point of view of health, we've had expert studies pointing in a very similar direction for all of them. So expansion of knowledge in all of these ways points to a transformation to reduce the size and weight of the human footprint on the planet, to consume less land and emissions-intensive food, including through reducing consumption of red meats, to reduce the amount of land under cultivation, to increase forested areas and their diversity, to economize on use of water in agriculture, and to do this while drawing on biological sources of the chemicals for industrial processes that were previously supplied by coal, oil, and gas. At the same time, knowledge has been expanding about how we can achieve these outcomes. Knowledge of more nutritious and palatable substitutes for old foods that have less damaging ecological impacts. Knowledge of farm and land management systems to improve the trade-off between environmental cost and value in use. Knowledge of regulatory arrangements that can encourage the necessary transformation. There's rising awareness of the need for fundamental change and the beginnings of knowledge that fundamental change is feasible. In this, For me, it feels like 2011 felt for the transition from fossil to renewable energy. Costs of change are still high. An increase in the scale of the new is starting to bring costs down. Transformation is unfamiliar and daunting, but beginning. Decarbonisation of electricity and electrification of industry and transport can remove about 2/3 of global emissions. The land use, agriculture and food transformation can deliver most of the rest. Einshausen and Durley in a paper early this year have shown that we can get most of the way to the Paris goals through renewable-based electrification and the land use transformation. And Australia is uniquely well placed to lead and prosper from the land use transformation, just as it is in energy. As with the energy transition, Australia's own transition in managing land should be seen in the context of global opportunity. So, agriculture and land use in Australian emissions. A chart with which you're familiar. I put this up at the beginning of the last couple of lectures. And we can see here the contributions of agriculture, substantial, and a slight decline from 1990 through to 2018, not much change. And then land use change and forestry, the purple at the end, a big decline to 1990, 2008, 2018 it became negative. Land use change emissions fell dramatically through the 1990s until about 96. If one wanted to mark political periods, we had quite a strong reduction until about 96, and then she drifted upwards until about 2007, and then came down quite rapidly for half a dozen years, and it's gone sideways since then. But this shift is a huge one, and without this, we would be looking truly miserable in our story. This is the one part of the Australian emission story that's gone consistently and strongly in the right direction. The other one that's gone in the right direction, but less consistently and strongly, is, of course, electricity emissions. And if I can go on to 5.4, this gives the components of land use emissions. We've had a shrinkage of the forest converted to other use, land clearing, a shrinkage over time, and quite a large increase in land converted to forest, the brown, and an increase in carbon sequestered in old forests. They're the main drivers of the story of moving from fairly high positive emissions in land use change to negative emissions over that period of 28 years. I want to go backwards. Anyway, the agricultural story, 5.3, is not such an interesting one. It hasn't moved very much. The main driver of change in agricultural emissions, the small variations are mostly to do with changes in the size of the cattle and sheep numbers. And that's driven mainly by drought, a couple of periods of drought, and then early in the 21st century saw sheep numbers in particular falling, sheep and cattle numbers, and that brought emissions down. And that's illustrated in chart 5.4, sorry, 5.5. And the biggest element is enteric fermentation from sheep and cattle, and methane from sheep and cattle ruminant processes. And that's moved around mostly with sheep and cattle numbers. And that won't change very much without a change in sheep and cattle numbers. Well, now let's take a closer look at the land use mitigation opportunity and the agricultural mitigation opportunity. What drives Australia's exceptional opportunity is an extraordinary per capita endowment of land in woodlands and forests. Our per capita endowment, about 33 tonnes per person, compared with a world average of about 6 and an OECD average of 8 or 9. That tells us that we've got a comparative advantage in any activities that depend on utilisation of woodlands and forests. Now, of course, the amount of carbon that we can hold in forests and woodlands is affected by rainfall, and that's affected by climate change. The applied atmospheric physics is still coming to grips with the effects of warming on rainfall in particular locations. Average rainfall rises in the world as a whole with increased atmospheric moisture, but the distribution changes. We've been told for a long time, and I reported at length what I was told by the scientists, that southern Australian latitudes are likely to experience lower rainfall, and on the whole, northern latitudes higher. I've got a chart showing changes so far, and this basically confirms, this is a decadal changes, but on the whole, we're seeing drying, the big drying, lowest on record, lowest decades on record are in these southern regions, especially the west coast. But northern regions are mostly showing above average rainfall in recent times. The south has been the source of most Australian agricultural produce in the past. With agriculture challenged by the combination of drying and warming, there will be shrinkage in the area of cultivation. Newly submarginal farms may be more productive as a source of biomass from suitably selected eucalypts. For example, the mallee in the northwest Victoria and southwest New South Wales, northern and eastern WA, and northern South Australian wheat belts. Wetter northern areas will be able to sustain more intense living biomass concentrations, making them potentially larger sources of biomass for harvesting or long-term carbon sequestration. In the 2008 review, I set out in table 22.2 the main opportunities for large-scale sequestration in changed land use. And I'd now like to talk a little bit about what we've learned about this potential over the past 11 years. Some items in that list in table 22.2 were speculative. The biggest numbers were my reference to ongoing work in the CSIRO and some state agricultural departments on the opportunities for sequestering carbon through restoring degraded arid woodlands. The type of country with very sparse sheep and cattle populations at the time, which at very little economic cost could be managed in a different way to restore woodland stocks over very large areas. I the most obvious opportunity was simply reducing land clearing, and we saw on that earlier chart 5.4 that we've made some progress on that, but there's still a lot of emissions from land clearing. In table 22.2, 11 years ago, I suggested 63 million tonnes per year reduction in carbon dioxide emissions could come from reduced land clearing. The latest official data from Australian sources now points to 45 million tonnes per annum. The difference is mainly that reductions in emissions from avoided land clearance decrease as emissions from deforestation fall. The Department of Environment and Energy in Canberra, in its most recent report on the National Inventory, says that the forest area increased by 4.5 million tonnes of carbon from 2010 to 2016. Net emissions were negative in the land clearance sector because the clearing was exceeded by increased plantings and growth elsewhere. In quantities, that's a big story in the Australian emissions framework. Back in 2008, I talked a lot about the opportunity on carbon and environmental plantings, what in the Kyoto Protocol is called post-1990 plantations. And I saw a lot of potential for that. I spoke of potential for 143 million tonnes per annum of emissions removal from 9 million hectares of land. A study by CSIRO and Hatfield Dodds in 2015 suggested numbers several times higher than that from fairly intense use of lower value land in the intensive agricultural zone. Climate Works and Beyond Zero Emissions have also come up with pretty large numbers for reforestation on relatively low quality land in the high rainfall areas. Most discussion of sequestration potential in the last decade has focused on these fast growing plantations in higher rainfall regions that are suitable for relatively intensive agriculture. I think that still undersells the potential for abatement of changes in land use, to which I drew attention back in 2008 and 2011. And I think this is still an understudied area. There's been bits and pieces of serious work since then, a little bit by the CSIRO, some by individual scholars. But there's 5.5 million square kilometres, 550 million hectares of arid country in Australia, which if managed, most of it with some sheep and cattle going over them in a fairly low value and unproductive way, which if managed in a different way could make a transformative contribution to sequestration. And I think that is a huge opportunity requiring a lot of research, a lot of attention. Quantitatively, that will be more important if we do it right than the use of the high rainfall country that at least at the margins will compete with high quality agriculture. The general story in the land sector is of immense potential for storing more carbon, and I would say especially in the vast rangelands. But great uncertainty about the potential because we haven't done the research that defines precisely the potential. I don't think any of the work in the last 11 years leads me to think that the potential is smaller than the very large numbers I put forward speculatively 11 years ago, but neither has the thorough work been done to confirm it. The 2008 and 2011 reviews made reference to the mallee as a source of subterranean sequestration and a sustainable source of biomass. But in table 22.2 in the 2008 report, I didn't put a number on the mallee potential. But in the text, I talked about it, and I've kept in touch with work, especially in Western Australia, on that. And I think the potential is immense. Separately, there's very large potential in what's called the Mulga country, areas of reasonably low rainfall, but sporadic rainfall through Queensland and New South Wales, which you would manage in a very different way from the Mallee country. And then there's in arid or low to medium rainfall Australia, you've got the savanna, which covers about 1/5 of the Earth's surface and much of northern Australia, whereas southern Australia is historically the home of most of the value of our agricultural production is drying in a warmer climate. The savanna country generally is experiencing increased rainfall. This is supporting more dense vegetation. This is happening naturally, and the scale of it's very large, and it creates opportunities for human intervention to increase sequestration of carbon. And if you drive around outback central Queensland, which I did with a couple of grandchildren in the school holidays recently, you can see the growth in the carbon stock in the bush, in areas alongside the roads, wherever it's been given a chance to respond to higher moisture. The human intervention could greatly increase that intensification of the carbon stock. The main intervention we've had so far has been timely burning mostly by Aboriginal link groups to avoid unnecessary loss of biomass in hot fires late in the dry season. I discussed this in the 2008 review and identified 5 million tonnes per annum of potential of carbon sequestration from establishing variations on the traditional burning theme. The Western Arnhem Land project was the world's first effort deliberately to support increases in the carbon stock through timely savanna burning. Jane and I had the good fortune to be shown over that, camping out in West Arnhem Land for a few days about a decade ago. And that successful exercise has been repeated across Northern Australia, with 75 projects having been registered with the Emissions Reduction Fund. It's one of the very productive uses to which Abbott's Emissions Reduction Fund has been put. And Australian technology based on Indigenous practices could be taken to similar opportunities elsewhere in the world. It's already being applied in dry areas of the western province of Papua New Guinea. So the general story of land use change is of immense potential through changes in Australian land use, but of small and diminishing effort to define the potential and the means of unlocking it. The absence of generally available incentives since the abolition of carbon pricing, with its link to the Carbon Farming Initiative, and a general reduction in research and development on agriculture, pastoral activities, forestry and climate change have contributed to the unsatisfactory situation. Well, just going on to agriculture, a major proportion of Australian emissions in agriculture are from enteric fermentation in cattle and sheep. I've put up the numbers. I suggested in 2008 potential for reduction by about 16 million tonnes per annum from a combination of biological interventions, changes in feed patterns, selective breeding, and shifts in pastoral land use. Most powerful lever is reduction in cattle and sheep numbers, and the biggest effect would come through just not running sheep and cattle on land where those activities are not very valuable at all, and where alternative activities would be more valuable. One would be carbon farming, and biodiversity farming, where incentives were in place for that. I still think that there's an opportunity for learning how to make better use of the kangaroo in that situation. The introduction of a carbon price and incentives for carbon sequestration would, I think, have a powerful effect there. 2008 review discussed opportunities for sequestering up to 68 million tonnes per annum through increasing carbon in soils. A lot of work has been done in this area, and the spread of low-till farming has gone a long way. In southern Australia, there's a challenge from drying and warming, because drying and warming tends to reduce carbon in soils, and so we have to run fairly fast to stand still in some places. In northern Australia, there's an easier run. And then finally, in table 22.2, I talked about the opportunity for using Australian biomass managed in different ways as a source of bioenergy, which did not compete with food land. As you know from last week's lecture on industrial activities, I now think that biomass is going to be so valuable in specialized industrial uses and for biofuel for purposes for which batteries and hydrogen can't easily compete. And at the moment, that looks like long distance civil aviation. It's going to be so valuable in those uses that we don't want to be converting a lot of it into bioenergy. There are cheaper ways of transporting ourselves around. So today I wouldn't emphasize the bioenergy potential, although it's got some place in the whole story. Now on the food challenge. The 21st century has seen strong momentum in economic growth and rising incomes in the developing countries, even after the financial crisis in 2008, since when incomes have stagnated in the developed countries. And we've seen quite rapid movement in many countries towards the food consumption patterns of rich countries like Australia. Chinese meat consumption rose tenfold over 40 years of reform and development to almost 70 kilograms per capita per annum, or about the average of the developed countries. Chinese meat absorbs more grain than direct human consumption, and so that ends up being a pressure on world grain markets. Chinese consumption is dominated by non-ruminant meats, pork and chicken and fish, which are more efficient in converting grain into animal protein and do not emit methane, but nevertheless places great pressure on land and the natural environment. I remember talking to the Minister for Agriculture in the early days of Chinese reform, a chap called He Kang, and he told me with some excitement that he was going to launch a blue revolution, fish farming in China. And he said if people are going to want to have a lot more animal protein, a lot more meat as they get richer, if they all eat beef and mutton like you do, then if it's beef, we'll need about 7 kilograms of grain for every kilogram of meat they eat. If a pig is much more efficient, we can get it down to 3 or 4 kilograms. A chicken is more efficient, we can get it down to a few kilograms. But if we can get them to eat fish, the fish is hugely biologically more efficient. It's cold-blooded, so it doesn't waste grain keeping warm, and it floats in water, so it doesn't waste grain in muscle tension to keep standing up like a chicken or a cow. And we can get it down to 2 kilograms of grain for each kilogram of fish. Well, since then, there has been a blue revolution in China with a huge growth in fish farming, but pork and chicken consumption has similarly exploded. South Asia, with its religious and cultural constraints on eating meat, and particularly beef, will not see similar increases in red meat consumption to China, but the pressures on land resources will still be large as they get richer. It's happening now. Successful development in Africa, essential for humanity's final release from the Malthusian trap, which I suppose more than anything else is my life's mission, is unlikely to place smaller pressure than China on food production and the natural environment. They like eating cows. The extension of something like the developed world's pattern of food consumption to the whole of humanity with successful global development in the 21st century is inconsistent with climate stability and more generally with the stability of ecological systems. It would also be unhealthy. And we've had recent contributions about health. This is from the report that just came out a few weeks ago from EAT Lancet, published by the Lancet group associated with medical research. It's done detailed research on what would happen in the next 50 years, presuming rising incomes along the pattern of the recent past through the developing world. If we adjusted diet with health considerations at the top of our list. The yellow is what will happen under business as usual, with a 50% increase in red meat, 100% increase in poultry. That's then the blue is what it would look like if we all ate what was best for nutrition and our health, and we'd be reducing red meat consumption by 70% in the world as a whole, despite the fact that poor people are getting richer in the developing world. We'd all be eating a lot more dry beans and lentils and soy, a lot more vegetables and fruits. But that's going to be a very influential report, driving part of the story, driving the food transformation. Now, when you talk about changing food patterns, then first instinct of a lot of people to think is impossible. But actually, human tastes in food change enormously and radically over relatively short periods of time. I'm going to illustrate that with reference to Australia. First of all, what's happened to the price of meat since I was early in high school. No, 1960, I was still in primary school. No, I was in high school, early high school. Since that time, poultry has fallen to about a quarter in real terms. This is adjusted for consumer prices, whereas the traditional Australian meats, and we were huge eaters of beef and veal and lamb and mutton, mostly old mutton actually, because our wool industry drove the sheep onto the market when you could no longer get a decent fleece off an old sheep. There's been a big increase in the relative price of lamb and mutton in particular, but also of beef and veal. Pork prices haven't increased much in real terms. They went down for a while and then lifted, and not a big variation, but a huge reduction in poultry prices. Well, we changed what we ate in response to that. An index number of 100 back in 1960, we've increased about 1,200 or 11-fold our per capita per kilogram consumption of poultry, and we've reduced our consumption of mutton and lamb by 90%. Now, there was no draconian regulatory pressure. It wasn't even any propaganda. People just did it because different foods became more readily available and the relative prices of different foods changed. So So it's possible to have quite large changes in your food consumption, and the changes we saw in the, as required in the EAT Lancet, I wouldn't require much more than that 90-odd% reduction in mutton and lamb production. So there's going to be a lot of momentum towards the food consumption revolution, which will be very helpful to climate mitigation, but also general ecological conditions. It will also help to reconcile the strong incomes growth in developing countries with feeding all the people on Earth. We'll get there through a lot of processes, but changing personal preferences will be one of the processes. The health story will become more influential everywhere. And that will be simply following trends we already see in high income and well-educated communities in the Western world. Larger numbers of people in the developed countries will be influenced by the climate, general ecological and animal welfare cases for greater reliance on plant-based food. And changing personal preferences, relative prices and technological opportunity will open the way to a revolution in production of meat-like manufactured goods. I've been waiting for this to happen for 10 years, and now I think there's evidence that it is. Processes using animal stem cells to grow chemically indistinguishable meat substitutes from biomass will become indistinguishable in taste, texture, and nutrition to meat from the killed animal, superior in nutrition if that's what you want. Vegetable-based foods with the taste and texture of meat will become closer to the real product for those who prefer it to unadulterated vegetarian fare. The price of both will fall eventually to below the rising price of farm meats. The first cell-based hamburger released in the United States a few years ago cost $300,000 US to produce. It can now be reproduced for about $10. Large-scale production will bring costs down to not much above the cost of the organic materials and renewable energy required for its production. Lower than farm-based meats of all kinds and far lower than the meat of cattle and sheep, which, because they absorb so many resources, are going to stay expensive. And I put up the data to show how much more expensive lamb and beef have become. More generally, there will be a shift in demand to higher quality, safer and more expensive food. And Australia has exceptional comparative advantage in supply of the higher value products that will dominate demand, especially in supplying the world's largest and most rapidly growing markets in Asia. The main meat substitutes make intensive use of biomass and energy and less use of water than the traditional competitors. Australia is well placed as a supplier to international markets. For those who continue to prefer meat in the old style, the kangaroo will have health and ecological advantages. The new foods will include growing proportions from hydroponic technologies using renewable energy. The Sundrop greenhouse in Port Augusta, producing tomatoes to supply Coles retail outlets all over the country from desalinated water using solar energy in an arid region, is an exemplar of the new order. Capital and expertise will be more important and water less in food production. This will enhance Australia's advantages in this new food world. I made quite a big story in the 2008 and 2011 reviews of the need for different international rules on handling land use change and agriculture. I'm not going to go through what I've prepared on that. It will be in the book, except to mention that there have been very substantial changes, and the Paris Agreement is a big improvement on the Kyoto Protocol, which I was relying in 2008 and 2011. Most importantly, the international community has now accepted that the natural climate solutions through land use change and agricultural change are a very important story and we're moving closer to acceptance of comprehensive carbon accounting in the international agreements. It's something I advocated back in 2008. It's something on which we've made real progress. So to conclude, it's now clear to the international community, as it was not 11 or 8 years ago, that changes in land use and agriculture will have a central role in avoiding high costs of climate change. Perhaps 2/3 of the global movement to zero emissions will come from decarbonisation of electricity and electrification of transport and industry. Nearly all of the remainder will come from changes in agricultural and pastoral activities and land use, with some help from decarbonised energy in those processes. And part of that story will be the use of biomass instead of coal and oil and gas in chemical processes in industry, where electricity and hydrogen can't do the job. If we move too slowly and overshoot the Paris targets, plant-based sequestration, including through the capture of carbon waste from plant-based industrial processes and storing or using them in ways that keep the carbon emissions out of the atmosphere, will be the main avenue for achieving negative emissions. A part of that will come through capture and storage of carbon dioxide waste from industrial processes and generation of revenue using biomass. The transformation of food, agriculture and land use that is necessary for climate change mitigation is necessary as well to allow the maturation of global development, to allow people everywhere on Earth to enjoy our living standards. Necessary to improve human health and to maintain a stable global ecology more generally. There will be one agricultural and land use transformation to serve these four great purposes. It's now clear to more Australians than it was 11 or 8 years ago that Australia has great advantages in this new zero emissions world. The opportunities for zero and negative emissions land use lower the cost of doing our fair share in a global mitigation effort and open new areas of comparative advantage in the zero emissions world economy. To make good use of this opportunity, Australia will need to put in place systematic incentives for reducing emissions in agriculture and land use and provide good reasons why they are here to stay. And it will need to restore an old national strength that has been allowed to decline in recent years. We will need to restore our old strength in research and education on agriculture, pastoral industries, forestry, and related industrial activities. The combination of low-cost renewable energy and abundant land for biomass will be powerful in the chemical, including synthetic food production industries in a zero-carbon world. Alongside our utilisation of opportunity in renewable energy, our strength in growing and using biomass will set Australia up as the superpower of the low-carbon world economy. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ross, for a really informative and clear account of developments in the agriculture and land use sector. We have some time for questions now. So does anyone want to ask a question? Yes, okay, up the back here first.
Yeah, hi, Stuart Donaldson from Polyworld. We're working on developing a water generating greenhouse that generates water from the air. And I'm just interested, Professor Garnaut, do you see that this sort of innovative technology would have much support from the authorities and the community as a whole?
Well, I think it's terrific you're doing it, because I think things like that will play a big role. I know the people who put up the Sundrop plant in Port Augusta, which is a variation on that theme, that they actually use renewable energy to turn seawater from the Spencer Gulf into the water they use in their greenhouse, but they do all the warming with renewable energy. I think variations on that theme are going to be very important. I think we need general incentives. The best incentive is what we had in place with the carbon price, because offsets from the farm and agriculture and land use sectors could be sold into the system. I would hope to, I think it's beyond hope for the immediate future, for the next few years, to have a general carbon price, but I think that reintroduction of that sort of support for land use and agriculture is not out of the question. Rather, there's been discussion recently of using international offsets for those Australian enterprises liable under the safeguard mechanisms. I think we'll have plenty of domestic offsets, and a project like that, there's ways in which you could generate domestic offsets, and that could provide the driver, the incentive. We also need support for innovation itself. If you're developing a new technology and you're the first doing it, you'll inevitably go up some dead ends. That's what happens to the first people to do anything. And that's why the economics says that there should be fiscal support for innovation, because you won't get enough of it without it, because the innovator teaches everyone about the dead ends, about all he or she learned along the way to making something successful. That's the role of the Australian Renewable Energy Agency. I think there is, I think it would be a good thing, but I think there's also opportunity for making sure that the support for innovation from the Australian Renewable Energy Agency is available more generally to innovation in carbon sequestration.
I think you were next.
Ian Blair, I'm in agriculture. Ian Blair, I'm in agriculture. Could you comment on the use of trees and cross-laminated timber in buildings? Because if that goes into the building, then it's sequestered. And there's several buildings, taxation department down at Docklands, built in third of the time, uses renewable materials rather than concrete. Is that of importance in your calculations?
Yes, I think that's potentially very important. And there's a lot of that sequestration goes on in our houses. Jane and I live in a place just up the road in Princes Hill that was built in the 1870s. That's got a floor that of Scandinavian timbers that they used to send off the wool and other materials, and they'd bring European timber back as ballast, and so there's been 130 years of sequestration of that timber, and it's still in pretty good shape. There is a problem of accounting, and this is one area in which the international system hasn't yet caught up with the sequestration realities. My understanding is that the Paris rule book still doesn't give proper credits, or any credits, for timber is treated as if it was burnt when you put it in the sawmill. And I think an efficient system would give credits for that, and we could provide credits through an offsets program like the Clean Energy Regulators Emissions Reduction Fund, broadened in the way I was talking about in the answer to the past question, but it's genuine sequestration to be encouraged.
Yes. Have we got any questions from the webinar? Okay. Yeah.
Thanks, Ross. Wonderful talk. This is Australia, of course. We've only got 1% of the emissions, roughly. We could be the best in the planet, zero carbon. Are we only reliant on international agreements to ensure the rest of the world pulls up their socks too, or are there other things we can be more active about?
I think the problem of socks are more ours than the rest of the world. If we'd changed as much as China has, we'd be in much better place. A developing country starting with a very low base and with huge construction to build the infrastructure of new cities, of new urbanization, naturally has a tendency to put in a lot of metal structures, but the intensity, the carbon intensity of economic activity has fallen faster in China. Europe does better than us, Japan does better than us, Korea does better than us. I don't think we should be worrying about making them pull up their socks. Let's pull up our own socks, and when they're right up, we can worry about the others.
One question from online, Ross, from Johan Kadina. You mentioned potential societal collapse in the first 2 lectures. Can the Australian agriculture sector be made more resilient? Can we still feed the population at 2, 3 or 4 degrees? Thank you.
Well, when I was thinking about societal collapse, the reference I made was to, and I was talking about what would happen in the absence of mitigation. And I was especially talking about the breakdown in political order in populous parts of the world where you're subject to great stress. And I specifically mentioned the Bay of Bengal, the West Bengal and Bangladesh. And I made the point that with unmitigated climate change, you would displace huge numbers of people from there, but really from a lot of the great cities of Asia, which disproportionate number of which are built on river deltas and very vulnerable to sea level rise. And my lifetime working on development has taught me that if you give society a fairly big shock, and it doesn't have to be a huge one, you can cause things to fall apart. And that's the societal disorder I was thinking of. I don't think what happens in Australia will be the immediate cause of societal breakdown here, but things fall apart here if things fall apart in Southeast Asia and South Asia.
Yes.
Following on from the earlier question, Councillor Jackie Fristacchi, City of Yarra, one of the things I wanted to ask you about was in terms of land use. You've talked about production really, but is the end result. We know from data in local government that 50% of waste is food. Where do you discuss it, and how do you discuss that in terms of the scheme of things in emissions reduction? Given and where does composting rate as against trying to encourage communities to reduce excessive consumption and use food more wisely?
Jackie, good to see you here. If I had a 7th lecture, I might make it on waste. It was part of the story in that EAT Lancet, where it said if we cut waste in half, what that would do to food demand. If you go back to that, and it would have quite a radical effect on use of a lot of foods. A lot of grain is wasted. Now some of that is through rodents getting out along the way, but then there's the waste you talk about. Which is waste in the use of food by consumers, and making better use of that as a well, it has very large sequestration potential, and we can do a lot better job of recycling materials. a lot of other countries do a better job than us. We have, yeah. So it's a really important set of issues, and don't take my not having a seventh lecture on that as a reason for undervaluing it. Yeah.
Yes, up the back.
Terry Tier, Renewable Intelligence. Ross, to welcome the incoming government on the 19th, what were your top few policy recommendations to make a meaningful start in this area?
The first thing I would urge is that they don't run too fast. Because I think that the objectives of this government, the 50% renewables by 2030, 45% reduction in emissions, are defensible. I think we could quite easily get quite a lot further than that, but to have those objectives is such a big step from where we are now that working purposefully towards them would be very important. We've got a lot of history in this country of vested interests capturing and diverting the process. And if we run too quick, that's what will happen. I'd like the government to really think through steps forward. But I would, in this area of land use and agriculture, my first priority would be to make sure that we, again, like we used to, properly resource research in all of the related land use questions. We used to be much better than we were at that. There's been a big reduction in public expenditure, both at Commonwealth and state level, on agricultural research, forestry research, land use research. Secondly, and at the same time, I would want a new government to lock in a general system of support for emissions reduction in the land use sector. The problem with the emissions reduction fund, it's much better to have had that than not to have had it. That's what you can say in Tony Abbott's defence. The only thing you can say. That it would have been worse to have not had it, because that kept going the administrative structure for administering the offsets from the farms sector, the carbon sector. So the mechanisms are there. Now, when we went from carbon pricing to the emissions reduction fund, we hugely reduced the financial potential support, because the support before came from selling permits to enterprises that were liable for the carbon price. I'd like us to get back to that, and so that any farmer or pastoralist or local government in the bush that wanted to use land in a different way and sequester carbon could rely on being able to sell permits. I think the way to do it is to make the generators of fugitive emissions pay for those. I mentioned that in the fourth lecture, and also the safeguard mechanism envisages purchase of credits. I think we'll have plenty of legitimate domestic credits, so we won't need to go overseas. In fact, we put in place these incentives, and we would end up being a seller of legitimate permits to the international community. So I'd want to do those two big things, but I would urge the government to make sure it's got things right before it runs into it.
Just on that note, can I ask, how do you think we could do a better job of framing the twin environmental crises, the water security challenge that we face right now and the climate change crisis, and getting them to articulate together a bit better with a view to getting more political action?
I don't know how you bring them together to get more political action. I've spent 11 years just talking about the climate issue and seeing if that makes some differences. There are special issues related to water that other people have done a lot of work on. They are obviously closely related issues. I don't have any clever ideas for how they can come together in a political campaign.
I think it is starting to come together on the Murray-Darling Basin.
Yes,
I
yeah.
see quite a bit. Okay, sorry, there was one more question up here and then we might have to end. Yes.
Hi, Kay Wanigal from BZE Radio. I note that you're referring to the Labor government and its 50% target. And I understand there are vested interests that have been impeding the progress of Australia's targets in the past. But the reality is that we're now in a climate emergency. The British government has just decreed the climate emergency, and it's been a bipartisan approach. Many countries around the world, and certainly many cities, are declaring that. Surely we in Australia should be looking at that as well. And ultimately, that's a government response, federal government response that we're all crying out for.
Yeah, I think that what's happened in Britain will be helpful to acceleration of action. I don't think that making that the centre of a political campaign right now would actually accelerate things. We've got a difficult political culture here where we're trying to get away from a government that is opposed to doing anything. Yeah. I think that if we were making purposeful progress for a few years towards 50% renewable energy and 45% emissions reduction, we would find, and we put in place the general mechanisms, including the pricing mechanism that I've talked about for agriculture and land use. We put in place the sorts of support for renewable energy that I talked about in the third lecture. Once we got to 50%, we would go quickly to 90 and 100%. So breaking the back of the old system and showing we can do it is the key, I think, building community confidence that we can make strong progress without everyone paying more for the electricity. They would actually pay less if we did it right, showing that we can manage land in a very different way with the right incentives. So making good progress towards 50% and 45% would be a transformative step. And my judgment is that that makes it possible after a few years to start talking very much more ambitiously. I'd be a bit worried that if you talk much more ambitiously now, it would make the people who take lumps of coal into the parliament make their job easier.
Okay, thank you very much, Ross, for a really optimistic take on the sector, I think, and also sharing your knowledge across all these different areas with us. We're very much looking forward to the final lecture next week. I just wanted to mention that each of these lectures is available through the websites of the different institutes that are sponsoring this. Maybe the easiest one to go to would be the Energy Transition Hub if you want to find it, and it'll be available in the following days. Ross is actually writing a book called Superpower Australia's Low Carbon Opportunity that is that these seminars are really the foundation of. For those of you who are interested in pre-ordering, and there's a discounter here, there's information available on these postcards, which I think are over here, and you can pick that up and pre-order. So once again, please join me in thanking Ross Garnaut.
Just as a quick reminder, next week's lecture, you can come here But there will be a BZE
I
event
was
here, so
in se-
next week's
I
lecture is
got my
over at the big
arithmetic wrong. I was
theatre
in
in
second year high
Gardner.
school in 1960.
Graham King, this was going to ask us, but this is something you make Graham King, his calculations just